You may have heard the line, disco didn't die, it was murdered. It was there one day and gone the next, a hit job by a rock and roll loving element of American culture. It was a fad already on the way out, that only needed the slightest push. And that's all true. Or is it? Now, this isn't a story about how disco was born. This is a story about a disappearance with real violence, hatred, and a surprising but often overlooked truth. And with this case, there are three distinctly different narratives, each a witness with their own story about how things went down in the late 1970s. Today, we're going to sift through the truth, the lies, and try and shake free a uniquely American bias. But now, let's hear some witness testimony. This story is extremely unreliable. It only makes use of hearsay and half-truths. Let's call this the layman's understanding, or disco dead by natural causes. Basically, in 1977, disco explodes across the states after Saturday Night Fever brings disco club culture to the mainstream. The pop junkies of the 70s dance themselves to exhaustion. The sound becomes tired, repetitive, overly commercial. Disco sucks bumper stickers, cultural change, Reagan, the 80s, all that. Disco's day is done. This story has some pretty serious problems. As you probably already guessed, it's way too simplistic, while ignoring some pretty unpleasant truths. It follows the public consensus, but not the facts. Witness number 2 has a much more complete and accurate narrative, but it too suffers from a very particular bias. Here, disco begins as a haven for oppressed minority groups. Black and Latino Americans, gay and trans people, as well as anyone trying to escape the bleak economic reality of the 1970s. And this is all undeniably true, and the economy was seriously hurting. America experienced inflation rates in the double digits, uneven growth, high oil prices, all of which hit already economically depressed groups the hardest. The murder, as this story goes, and these events are verifiably true, took place on Thursday, July 12, 1979, at Comiskey Park in Chicago. A night of baseball, a doubleheader between the White Sox and the Detroit Tigers. Now, the White Sox were experiencing a particularly lean season, something that was driving them to think outside of the box, to drive up sales for tickets, and to whip up support for their flailing team. To this end, they tapped local shock jock radio personality and anti-disco crusader Steve Dahl to lead a promotion aimed at capturing the interest of his bridge and tunnel rock and roll oriented audience. The promo was simple, but absolutely insane. Bring a disco record, and your ticket only cost 98 cents, which even in 1979 was a serious bargain. Oh yeah, and they were also going to put all these records in a giant crate and literally blow it up between the two games.
So we took all the disco records that you brought tonight, we got them in a giant box, and we're going to blow them up real good.
In a season where the franchise had struggled to bring in more than 10,000 individuals a game, a whopping 50,000 fans and disco haters showed up at the gates of Comiskey Park. Many were left outside, some hopped fences and came in illegally. The crowd was already rowdy, and there was concern things might go awry before the event had even begun. As the crowd slowly filtered in and records were being taken, an usher noticed that the records weren't just disco, but also funk, R&B, and soul. It seemed like some attendees didn't see this as a repudiation of a genre like disco, but perhaps something driven more by prejudice. Well, the first game finishes up with the Tigers winning 4-2. The shock jock blows up the records and destroys a good chunk of the outfield in the process. Fans begin throwing records and storming the field, a riot ensues, and the White Sox have little choice but to forfeit the game. The chaos does eventually come to an end, but it takes riot police and several hours to disperse the crowd. Disco lies bleeding. Now, compared to our first story, this narrative has a lot more substance. It reads like any good headline, the night that disco died. And the events it outlines are true, but some of the conclusions drawn about it are a bit shaky. It all ties up a little too nicely. Was this really the exact moment that disco disappeared? Or is it just a manifestation of the pent-up anger of a certain demographic? Chicago is not the United States, and although it may be surprising to some, the United States is not the world. What I'm driving at is whether this is a local, a national, or a global destructive event. And with those questions still unanswered, we arrive at our third narrative. This one does a good job of tying up all our loose ends. Let's call it Disco, the Vanishing Act. So we know why disco gained popularity. and we know that certain people wanted it gone. We also know that the high period of disco was certainly over in America moving into the 1980s. In fact, the Grammys actually had a Best Disco Record category for a single year in 1980, but they quickly swept it away as public opinion soured. The fever had finally broken. Or had it? You see, disco is far from just an American phenomenon. The elements of disco that we recognize today certainly developed there, but they didn't stay there for long. Disco swept across the world with scenes popping up in Africa, Europe, and Asia, each adding their own flair and take on the genre.
And here's the rub. Disco couldn't have been murdered, because it was found living abroad under a new identity, essentially. Now, I could make an entire series on international disco scenes that survived well into the 80s and beyond, but today I'm just going to give you a little taste of one of the most successful bastions of disco continuity. This is a glimpse into a world where disco never lost its cool. For Americans, it's a parallel universe where the chintz and glamour or the groove never faded away. Of course, I'm talking about Italo disco.
Italo disco is a fascinating genre, where disco is allowed to develop and incorporate new elements, both from local Europop and disco scenes, but also from the changing arsenal of musical technology that musicians and producers had access to. And Italo disco is more than, well, Italian disco. First off, it's mostly sung in English, and there are a few reasons for this, but primarily because Italian artists and companies that produced them wanted to achieve a pan-European appeal. And since English was, and still is, the European lingua franca, it was an easy choice. The genre was also more electronic, less orchestral, and relied heavily on synthesizers and drum machines. If you're into disco or just like catchy songs that you can sing in the shower, it's definitely worth diving into this fascinating disco offshoot.
As a genre, it's fun, it's punchy, it's really quite experimental sometimes too. It's an absolute party, and it never had to stop. There was no Disco Demolition Night in Europe that would bring it to its knees, and the rock and roller backlash in Europe just wasn't quite as strong as it was in America. Disco, and the elements that make up disco, can also be heard in Japanese pop music right up till the 90s. This disco-y influence is a big part of what people call Japanese city pop, or new music. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about this fascinating era of Japanese pop music, I've put a link in the description to my guide to all things Japanese city pop. But what's the lesson here? What can we take away from disco's banishment in the States, its changing form, and its continued success in Europe? Well, I think we can get a glimpse of it in the smoldering crater left in the White Sox outfield. Sometimes it becomes cool to hate on a genre. It's easy to get swept up in this. Nobody wants to be a social pariah, and having your musical tastes maligned can feel tantamount to having your identity attacked. But there is enjoyment outside the trend. Ask yourself, what's tacky right now? Maybe there's an artist or even an entire genre that you've ignored because of some sort of post-trend cringiness. What I'm trying to say is that maybe if we paid a little less attention to the noise, we could pay a little bit more attention to the music. Thank you everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I know this video is a little bit different than my usual stuff. I usually do genre deep dives, but that's all for now. Thank you so much, and I'll see you on the dance floor.